Hello and welcome to episode number 4 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode we are going to be talking about fat loss fundamentals. So you may remember in my last episode we talked about muscle building fundamentals, and conveniently this leads us on to fat loss fundamentals. So we're really going to be diving deep into this topic, and hopefully at the end of the podcast you'll have lots of information you can then go start applying immediately and start seeing some progress. So the very first thing that must be in place for fat loss to take place is a net energy deficit. This is the fundamental law of thermodynamics. So you need to be consuming less calories than you're burning, essentially. A lot of people fail with this because the majority of individuals are not consuming sufficient protein. One, it's not just a case of reducing calories, macronutrients also need to be taken into account. In addition to this, the vast number of people fail to realise that this energy balance equation is not static. It's important to note that the more body fat you'll lose, your quote-unquote maintenance calories will therefore fluctuate. So you're going to have to be constantly measuring your progress and then adapting both calories and or expenditure via cardio to continue to lose body fat. Now it's also important to note that timing, food combining doesn't override a net energy deficit. There's no magic here. So you'll see a lot of fads within the fitness industry, people claiming you even need to eat more calories to lose body fat, to people claiming that carb backloading is a method where you can essentially reduce body fat without being in a net energy deficit. And these are all topics that I'll be diving deep into in other episodes. However, within this episode, I want to try and just focus on fat loss fundamentals. So those topics will certainly be coming up. It's also important to note another misconception. I know I mentioned this in one of the previous episodes where people start avoiding certain food groups because they're considered quote-unquote bad or they're told they shouldn't eat these. And the reality is when an individual does this, by default they're essentially just reducing their total calories by removing X food and not subsequently replacing those exact same calories and macronutrients. Quite obviously they're going to be consuming less calories than they were previously, and by default they'll probably start making progress. But just remember, it wasn't the food avoidance, it was just the reduction in total calories that saw the net fat loss. Now before we dive in, I want to briefly go over that nutrition pyramid I've talked about twice, mentioned by Eric Helms within that YouTube series. And he essentially has this pyramid, this hierarchy of importance. And at that top of the hierarchy of importance is total calories, energy balance. Underneath that we've got the absolute macronutrients, so protein, carbohydrates and fats. Underneath that, micronutrients, water and fibre. Underneath that, meal frequency, timing. And beneath that, supplement. Now the point I'm making here is you can't focus on one of these bottom criteria without taking care of the fundamentals, e.g. total calories, energy balance, total macronutrients. So that's not to say that the bottom few don't have their place, they do, but make sure that fundamental principle is in place first. Now how do we start? How do we go about setting up calories, macronutrients and our training to start seeing fat loss progress? Now it's important to note that I'm giving an example for someone who wants to solely lose body fat and by default is trying to maintain as much muscle mass as possible. Now we first of all need to essentially set calories. So there's a couple of options you can do. You can use my free ebook on my website. So if you go to jameslaytonfitness.co.uk, Layton, you'll be able to download my free ebook, and I basically teach you how to set your starting calories for either fat loss or muscle growth. So you could use this, or you can even use an online calculator. Now, as I mentioned within the previous episode, these calculators are not 100% accurate. However, the goal of these calculators is to essentially give you a starting point to work from. Therefore, you can then measure your progress on a weekly basis and then manipulate either calories or training to move you closer to your goals. Conversely, you could actually just start tracking your food intake, what you're consuming at the moment, and then manipulate calories and macronutrients from there. because by default you're going to have unequivocal data of how your body's responding to the absolute food intake you're already consuming. So there's another method you could use there. And obviously if you're already tracking your food intake, it's very easy because you're just manipulating calories and or training to move you closer to your fat loss goals. Now once you use my ebook or an online calculator, you're then going to set protein. So this is by far the most important macronutrient. So first of all, as I mentioned on my previous podcast, I want to mention that very recent Eric Helms review when he was looking at protein intake within the context of natural bodybuilding contest prep. So this really does relate to the majority of people listening to this podcast. Most of you are trying to maintain as much muscle mass as possible. So these figures are very relevant. And the result was, if you try and focus on consuming 2.3 to 3.1 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Now it's not to say there may be some outliers to this, so people that may perhaps need to consume slightly more protein, or conversely some people can probably get away with consuming slightly less protein. But it's important to note there's no real negative impact by going slightly over protein requirements. So in my opinion, it's best to err on the side of caution, have slightly too much than too little, because too little is going to mean by default more muscle mass loss during the net energy deficit. So this was published in 2012, so if you want to look this up online, feel free to take a look at it. Now before we move on to carbohydrates and fats, we need to also address why I set protein requirements based on body weight and not lean mass. Essentially, it's very difficult to actually accurately gauge an individual's lean mass. Even the most accurate form at the moment, to my knowledge, is the DEXA scan. Even that has its discrepancies, it's very expensive, it's very difficult to accurately gauge a person's lean body mass. Therefore, I would set your protein targets based on body weight. However, word of caution, obviously if you're more of an overweight individual, someone over 20-25% body fat who's a male, I would certainly focus on setting your protein targets on your goal body weight, because by default protein is going to come way too high for an individual like yourself. So work out your goal body weight and then match protein in line with that. However, for everyone else, if you set protein on total body weight. And if you're a female and you're 25% body fat and above, I would again focus on your goal body weight for protein. So now we've set protein and calories, we can then look at setting carbohydrates and fats. Now currently there's no real hard evidence to suggest which is more optimal in terms of the fat to carbohydrate ratio, other than meeting the minimum essential fatty acid intake, which by default a traditional diet is going to meet this very easily. However, I do have some vague guidelines which you can plug in. So anywhere between 0.5 to 1.5 grams of fat per kilogram of body weight is a good starting point. And then with carbohydrates, you're essentially just making up the rest of the calories. Once you've set calories, you set protein, then you'll set fat, and then carbohydrates will meet the rest. So as I briefly mentioned above, the carbohydrate and fat ratio should be mainly down to personal preference. So once protein's been set, the remaining calories, it doesn't really matter whether that's coming from mainly carbohydrates or mainly fat. I would let preference dictate this. However, for most individuals, especially on the leaner end, there's certainly a lot of positive advantages to consuming as much carbohydrates as possible. This is going to really help with maintaining strength in the gym and therefore maintaining total lean mass during the energy deficit. However, that's not to say that there aren't individuals that do very well on a higher fat intake, lower carb intake. Let preference dictate the ratio between the two. So now we've set protein, we've set calories, we've set carbohydrates and fats. You've now got a starting point to work from. We're now going to discuss the training component. Now for those you don't know, with regards to people trying to optimize body composition, e.g. losing body fat while maintaining as much muscle mass as possible, which is basically everyone who wants to lose fat, weight training should be the foundation of your training routine. Let me repeat that again. If you're male or female, weight training should be the foundation of your routine with the goals of losing body fat. The main reason is lean mass retention during the fat loss phase. Maintaining as much lean mass as possible. The majority of the weight loss is going to come from adipose tissue, so body fat, obviously some glycogen and water as well. Now, I've discussed in a little bit more detail within the muscle building, the specifics of the training, and this will probably be a future podcast, but it's beyond the time we have available today. But you really want to be focused on mainly the big compound lifts, so squat, deadlift, bench press, overhead press, and variations of this. You're trying to maintain as much strength in the gym, you're trying to maintain as much volume as you had within your muscle building phase. However, it's important to note by default, transitioning to the fat loss phase, volume is going to drop to a degree, purely because you just don't have the calories now to recover from and be able to maintain that strength like you did in the muscle building phase. Now next we're going to move on to cardio. So now we've got the nutrition foundation in place. You're doing your weight training, you're going to be tracking your progress, which you're going to talk about later. When and how do you add cardio? Now firstly we need to look at whether it's even necessary initially. You really want to start with as little cardio as possible. Let me repeat that again. You want to start with as little cardio as possible. So remember our hierarchy of importance. Once you've got that nutrition foundation in place, the weight training is our foundation. By trying to add too much cardio in the beginning, we essentially potentially could impact our progress within our weight training. Therefore, potentially strength will drop and therefore muscle mass will be lost. Now, does that mean that everyone should start their fat loss phase with zero cardio? Quite obviously not. It really depends on the individual. But if you're a leaner individual, depending on how much time you've got to get to a certain body fat percentage, you want to start with little cardio as possible. And you really want to see cardio and drops in calories as trump cards. The more trump cards you've got, the better. So by starting out with as many calories as you can, as little cardio as you can, we've now got plenty of trump cards to essentially use if and when we reach a fat loss plateau, which will happen. Conversely, if we started with very low calories and lots of cardio, if and when we reach a plateau, which we will at some point, we don't really have anywhere to go. We don't have a lot of calories to drop from, and we don't have much time left in our week to fit any more cardio in. So hopefully you can see that principle. So you really only want to be adding cardio if and when required. So that's why it's so important you're measuring your progress, because if you don't know if you're making progress or not, how are you going to know when to add in cardio and or drop calories? Also, when you do add your cardio in, again, we want to make sure that our weight training is still our hierarchy of importance. Therefore, the timing of the cardio should either be after the weight training session itself and or another time of the day. Therefore, give yourself the best opportunity to maintain performance in the gym with the weights, which is our main focus. With regards to cardio type, high intensity interval training or low intensity steady state, or MIS, moderate intensity steady state, going to discuss this on a future podcast episode. The context will dictate which approach is used, if not a combination of both. Both have pros and cons. Now next we want to discuss how to measure progress. Like I said, this is absolutely paramount. So in addition to tracking your food intake using potentially MyFitnessPal, a free application on your phone, it's important to know there are some discrepancies and inaccuracies with MyFitnessPal. However, it's pretty good for the most part. So once you're tracking your food intake and your training, so this is the lifts you're using, so the weights, reps, sets. Once you're tracking that, then it's a case of measuring body composition changes. A couple of key things we want to be measuring: your body weight, body fat percentage if you have access to this. It's important to know that calipers can be inaccurate and the bioelectrical impedance are very inaccurate. However, both of those could potentially be used with the sense of you're measuring the net change each and every week. So even if there are inaccuracies with the calipers, for example, if you're measuring the net change, you can see whether you're making progress or not. In addition to girth measurements, I'd suggest doing chest, shoulders, arms, a few across your abdomen, legs, calves. In addition to pictures are absolutely golden, especially with females as well, because as I'm going to mention in a second, because of their menstrual cycle throughout the month, gauging progress via the scale doesn't always show the fat loss progress due to water retention. So using pictures, it's a great tool, and for males as well, because sometimes, because you're seeing yourself every day in the mirror, it's difficult to be entirely objective whether you're making progress or not. You've got a couple of options. You could do these measurements once a week, which I'd suggest. With regards to the weight, I have some of my clients measure themselves every day, some of them just once a week. Both are pros and cons. The good thing about measuring every day of the week, you can get a average weight for the week because of certain water fluctuations throughout the week. It will give you somewhat a more objective target. However, it really depends on the clients. So as I mentioned, a brief note on females. Due to their menstrual cycle, it can be really difficult to gauge progress, especially just using the scale, because of those water fluctuations throughout the month. Therefore, sometimes you could be potentially measuring someone's body weight when they're maintaining water, and then you could be measuring them again another time and they're not holding on to as much water. So it's really difficult to be entirely objective. I would suggest still making your measurements weekly, but I would then focus on potentially measuring 2 periods over a longer time to be more objective with your measurement. Next, we're going to move on to how to make changes to continue to progress and some very good ballpark targets to aim for in terms of body weight loss per week. So as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, it's important to note that your maintenance calories are going to be moving, they're going to be changing. So a very good starting point to work from is 0.5 to 1% weight loss per week. This is a great target to aim for. Now it's important to note, especially if you're more of an overweight individual, you may be even above this is fine, but for the most part this is a pretty good figure. If you're a leaner individual, 0.5% is probably going to be the target you're aiming for. If you're slightly more body fat, 1%. And obviously this is going to be harder and harder the more you diet. So once you've hit a fat loss plateau, you've got a couple of options. You can either decrease calories and or increase expenditure through cardio. So if you were to drop calories, somewhere between 5 to 10% is a great ballpark figure. So protein is going to stay the same, and the drop will either come from carbohydrates or fats, or a combination of both. However, this really isn't black and white. The context of where the client is will dictate the amount of changes I make. And if you were adding cardio, you want to add a small amount. So whether it could be a 10-minute HIIT session or a 20-minute lift session, something relatively small, then you can measure your progress next week. Hopefully you'll start seeing progress, and then when you hit another plateau, you can make another change. Now with regards to having calories the same on training days versus non-training days, this really doesn't matter for the most part, because you need to bear in mind the overall goal, which is to achieve that net fat loss at the end of the week. And it's important to note that the type of training you're doing is going to be weight training, a little bit of cardio. It's not endurance training. Therefore, your training day caloric requirements, even though they will be greater than your rest day, it's not like you're an endurance training twice a day where carbohydrate requirements would fluctuate massively. Therefore, for the most part, I don't really see any need to fluctuate calories on training days and non-training days. However, that's not to say that you couldn't do higher calories, carbohydrates training days and a little bit less non-training days. But just remember, the net caloric intake will be the same at the end of the week. So just bear that in mind. So if you were to go slightly higher training days, just make sure to make up for that on the non-training days. Now finally, we need to discuss higher carbohydrate refeed days. This is probably another topic that could be a podcast in itself. And essentially the goal of this higher carbohydrate refeed day is to negate some of the negative effects of dieting, so metabolic rate slowdown, a decrease in leptin. So by having a day of maintenance carbohydrates or even slightly above, this can help give your metabolic rate a boost, increase leptin, and then you're going to go back to your traditional dieting calories. And it can also give you a little bit of a psychological break. This can be used especially for a leaner individual, and the frequency of this refeed it really depends. It's difficult to give some black and white figures, but for the most part, the leaner they get, the more refeeds they're likely to need. So that's pretty much everything. So hopefully you've got lots of information you can start applying immediately. If you haven't already got that free ebook on my website, go to Layton, Layton, fitness.co.uk, and you can download that. The other thing to note is just patience. This is a slow process, especially if you're a very advanced individual, you're trying to get sub 10% body fat. This is going to take several months, or if you're even going to enter a bodybuilding show, the contest prep is more like 5-6 months. It really is. So don't think this is get shredded in 8 weeks or anything like that. This does take a lot of time. So thank you very much for listening. I'll look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care.